Welcome back. This is the second video of the seventh class for social psychological perspectives on health. In the first video, I talked about the barriers to the barriers to successful social identity change. And in the first part, I talked about educational context, and in the latter part, I talked about some examples of housing context and community context. And to conclude this chapter, I'd like to talk something that may not be efficiently emphasized during the lectures. So in the first part, in the beginning of this chapter, I talked about health gradient, and they say that the differences in status, in social status, actually differently. Well, the differences in social status affect their health conditions. So that those in the upper status tend to have better stress than the lower status, and then every increment of status difference is related to even better health. And we talked that if they belong to positively valued groups, then they are more likely to have better health. So whether they actually can develop group membership and group identification is a key for their health. But I would like to clarify that this health gradient is not always a problem of psychology. So when I say that whether people can develop social group identification is a key, it sounds like it's the problem of psychology. But I'd like to emphasize that that is not the only problem or only the cause. So the reason why I say that the psychology is not the only cause of the problem is that whether people could belong to positive groups or not is not the problem of the individuals, but whether society as a whole can provide resources for people to belong to groups is a problem, is a cause. So it has to be tackled by large-scale action that affects whole communities. Communities or societies that provide people multiple group membership and social identity capital are needed. So memberships and identities are influenced by wealth and statuses. These inequalities need to be addressed. So whether people can actually develop good and strong group identification is dependent on the status of each group. This is what I said during the lecture. And whether each group stands in high status or in low status is not the problem of individuals, but such inequality. But society creates such inequality. So this kind of social issues need to be addressed by communities or more like government probably. And this is not something that that should be left for individuals. This is not something that should be left for individuals to address. So in order for each individual to develop good, positive, strong group identification, societies as a whole need to equally distribute resources for each group and for each individual, so that each group can be treated equally and each individual can perceive their group as positively as possible. Okay, so I think to summarize what we have learned in this chapter, I would like to say that group identification is important, and such group identification can be difficult to achieve if the group is negatively perceived or devalued. And in order for such groups to restore positive status, society as a whole needs to work on. Okay? Okay, so today we would like to move on to chapter 5. I will just skip the chapter 3 chapter 4, I guess. And if you're interested, please take your time to read the chapter in the textbook. But today I'd like to talk about chapter 5, stress. So people have different kinds of stress, and then but it doesn't same people have different stress sources of stress, and then they would experience them differently. But even if they have same sources of stress, it doesn't mean that they would experience them similarly. So people deal with sources of stress differently. Those who responded more positively to sources of stress also receive a lot of support from their family or colleagues. So this is kind of correlation, This is not a cause and effect, but when they actually perceive some sources of stress positively, then other people may also willing to help such people. And is this a cause and effect, or is it just a correlation, or is there any third factor that influence how we perceive the stress and then how others would give us support? Okay. So in this chapter, we try to understand what makes differences between people or times. Sometimes people perceive a same source of resource positively, and in other time they may perceive that as negative. They may perceive it negatively, or one people may perceive a source of stress as positive, while other people may perceive the source of stress as negative. And what makes these differences? And in particularly, we'd like to learn what role do groups play in this process. So throughout the last 3 chapters, we have been talking that, okay, behavior matters for health, but behavior is determined by our psychology. And what kind of psychology we develop within ourselves are also influenced by what kind of groups we belong. And then how the groups influence our psychology and the behavior is the most important interest of this course. So we'd like to know what role groups play in this process. And then I will argue that the textbook argues that the way we understand potentially stressful events and the way we respond to them are influenced by the groups we belong. Okay? So before understanding the role of groups in this process, we would like to see how the current or traditional approaches understand the stress. First, the biomedical model, the importance of physiology and adaptation. So in the biological or biomedical model, the definition of stress is a strain that is imposed on a person by stresses in the environment that are perceived to be in some way threatening to the self. And in this definition, stresses refer to poor living or working conditions, adverse life events, fraught relationships, and reasonable demands. So basically, stresses is a source of stress. So if you are feeling stress from your interpersonal relationships, then the stressor is that interpersonal relationship. And in the biomedical model, the general adaptation syndrome is the typical model to understand how people respond to stresses. And in this model, there are 3 distinctive phases. The first one is alarm or shock phase. The second one is counter shock phase, and the third one is exhaustion. So if you Google this general adaptation syndrome, you'd find a figure like this. Okay. And then you could divide these into 3. Okay. So the first part, here, this is an alarm phase, and this is a counter shock phase, and this is an exhaustion phase. So let's look at each one of them. Alarm phase, a person registers a threat and experiences a state of physiological arousal. So the y-axis indicates the stress resistance, how much they could resist against the stressors. So when they first in the alarm phase, basically they are shocked by the presence of stressor. So they are vulnerable to the stressor, and then they may experience some physiological arousal, and then that could lead to a health problem. And but soon after the alarm or shock phase, the body respond with as the body respond to the stressor as in the counter shock phase. So in the counter shock phase, a person becomes more aroused. They become even more aroused, and to attempt the counteracting the stressor and the resistance. So in the counter shock phase, the body is more aroused in a way that they can counteract the stressor. Or so in this phase, they are less vulnerable to the stressor. They are very much ready to fight against the stressor. And in this situation, they may be physiologically more strong, and then they can, stay strong, basically. But this phase requires a lot of physiological and mental resources. And then if this stage takes too long, they would enter the third phase, exhaustion phase. Their adaptation energy is depleted during the counter shock phase, and the equilibrium cannot be restored, and they are no longer able to function effectively. So when the counter shock phase takes too long, then they would become vulnerable again to the stressor. And then in such situations, they may develop physiological problems. So yeah, as I said, second stage requires them to expend mental and physiological resources, which is called adaptation energy, to restore equilibrium. So if they successfully respond to stresses, then let's use different color pen. Let's see. Okay. If they successfully respond to the stresses, they would go like this. They would not experience exhaustion phase. They would just achieve equilibrium. Okay. So successful counteracting leads to state salutogenesis or eustress, opposite of stress, and overall experience of stress can be positive. So in previous lecture, I talked about threat and challenge. So when people can successfully counteract the source of stress, then they would perceive such stresses as a challenge to their growth. And then if such perception can be achieved, then they would perceive the whole experience as more positively. But when they fail to successfully counteract the stresses, it would require longer resistance and eventually leads to exhaustion. So if they used up all the energy here, then they would just go down to the exhaustion. And a chronic form of stress. So if people always experience stress, they would it would lead them to be the state of burnout. And in the burnout, there are three components: exhaustion, lack of accomplishment, and callousness. Or in the textbook, they said it as depersonalization. Callousness basically means the indifference or the a lack of emotion. So people cannot experience any joy or sadness anymore. And burnout leads to heart disease, stroke, kidney damage, failure of the digestive and immune systems, and even cancer and early death. So burnout can be very threatening to our health. While the biomedical model explains how people may respond and then how much vulnerable people could be against the stresses. It doesn't explain what determines whether people are able to successfully resist particular stressor. Okay. It doesn't explain what determines whether people are able to successfully resist particular stressors or not. So in basically, biomedical model explains only how people may respond to stresses, and then if the way they react was successful, then they would restore health status. But if fail, then they would develop some kinds of disease. But it doesn't explain who or how or why people can successfully respond to stress. And to answer who would successfully respond to stresses, there is a dispositional model, the role of personality and the individual differences. So I guess this is somewhat more like a psychological model. So in this model, it argues that individual differences that contribute to heart-related problems. So there are individual differences that contribute to heart-related problems. And here, by individual differences, I do not mean about, I do not refer to behaviors such as exercise or smoke, but more like their personality, whether their personality is type A or type B. So type A behavior pattern, they in short they say TABP. So type A people tend to be hostile, aggressive, demanding, irritable, and ambitious. And there is a different type of people, type B behavior pattern, TBBP, the more laid back and relaxed behavior pattern. So maybe I think it would be interesting to think which type of person you are. Are you type A person or are you type B person? And then while in the early stage of this research, researchers thought that people can be distinctly separated or defined as whether as type A or type B, but now they are understood as two ends of a continuum, not distinct types. So some people are more like type A and some people are more like type B, but there are people like in between, you know. The degrees to which individuals have more intense and hostile reactions to various life stressors. So how much they may intensely or intensely react the stresses or hostilely react to the stresses. So this is somewhat like individual differences that try to explain who would be more successful at reacting against the stresses. How so maybe you would expect that the type A person would be more likely to fail to respond successfully toward stresses. But the relationship between TABP and health outcomes is weak at best. So it looks like promising to predict whether what kind of people can successfully react against the stresses, but it doesn't predict well. And there are surely various reasons why it doesn't, or that this distinction of type A and type B doesn't well predict health outcomes. But the way this research was the way this research started was already controversial. So Friedman and Rosenmans first proposed this type A and type B distinction, but their work was actually funded by the tobacco industry. So they argued that type A person is type A personality is related to like disease such as cancers. But this was a way to reduce the connection between tobacco and health outcomes. So when they conducted or then when they proposed these kinds of research, there is already argument that smoking tobacco is related to developing lung cancer. And in order to divert people's attention towards such relationship, these Friedman and Rosenmans were funded by tobacco industry to look for other factors that lead to lung cancers. And this is what they propose. So those with type A behavior pattern tend to be more tend to develop cancers more. But a meta-analysis showed that TABP did not predict heart-related problems. Okay, sorry, not the cancer, but the heart-related problems. And then after this research, there are other personality factors that were proposed to be related to health-related problems, such as type C, and then I cannot remember from top of my head, but there are different kinds of personality that were proposed to be related to health problems, but they also failed to explain differences in how people experience stressful events. So we were back to the original question: what makes a person have particular stress-related characteristics in the first place? We still do not know why some people have particular stress-related characteristics, or why some people negatively, or why some people fail to successfully respond to stress while other people do well, or why some people sometimes successfully respond and sometimes unsuccessful at positively responding stresses. Okay, so I will just stop here. Okay, actually, this was this was the second video of the seventh class. So I will just stop the seventh class here, and then we will continue in the eighth class. We will continue the rest in the eighth class. Okay, thank you.